She was lying face down in the Texas dirt, broken fingernails, blood caked on her back, letters carved into her skin like a brand on cattle. 3 days without water, left for dead by the most powerful man in the territory. When the cowboy found her, she whispered 4 words that would change everything. "Do not take me back." He should have walked away. He had spent 6 years hiding from the world. 6 years running from a dead brother and a gun he swore never to touch again. But something in her eyes made him stay. What he did not know was that saving this woman would drag him straight into the jaws of the monster he had been running from. And she was carrying evidence that could bring down an empire, or get them both killed. This is not just a love story. This is a story about 2 broken people who found each other in the dust, about the price of justice and the cost of silence, about what happens when you finally stop running and start fighting back. This story teaches us something important. Broken does not mean finished. The deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strength. And sometimes the person who saves you is also the one you were meant to save. If you have ever felt alone, afraid, or beyond repair, this story is for you. Now, before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. If stories like this speak to your heart, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Tap the bell so you never miss a new story, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you are listening from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Your support helps us keep creating content that matters. Now settle in, get comfortable. This journey is just beginning. The vultures found her first. 3 of them circled low over the dry wash, black wings cutting lazy patterns against a blood-red sunset. Cole Brennan watched them from his corral, one hand resting on the neck of the black Mustang stallion he had been trying to break for 3 weeks. The horse was wild. Wilder than any Cole had worked before. It fought him with everything it had, teeth and hooves and pure, stubborn will. But Cole was patient. He had nothing but time these days. Nothing but endless hours of silence and solitude, and the kind of loneliness that seeps into your bones like winter cold. 6 years he had lived like this. 6 years since he hung up his gun belt and walked away from everything he had been. 6 years of breaking horses and mending fences and trying to forget the face of a dead younger brother. Then the Mustang froze, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed on something beyond the canyon entrance that Cole could not see. He followed the horse's gaze to those circling birds. 1/4 mile east, maybe less. Something dead out there, or dying. Cole turned back to his work. Whatever lay in that wash was none of his concern. He had made himself a promise when he came to this canyon. No more trouble, no more violence. No more putting himself in positions where people got hurt because of him. Whatever was drawing those vultures could stay out there and rot for all he cared. But the Mustang would not settle. It paced and snorted, agitated, pawing at the dirt like it was trying to tell him something important. The animal had been wild as sin for 3 weeks, fighting every attempt Cole made to gentle it. Now it was practically pushing him toward the canyon entrance. His old hound dog, Dust, started barking. The dog had been sleeping in the shade of the water trough, same as every afternoon. Now he was on his feet, hackles raised, staring east. Cole muttered a curse under his breath. He had learned to trust horses. He had learned to trust dogs even more. They sensed things that men could not. And both of them were telling him something was wrong out there in the wash. Against his better judgment, Cole saddled his mare and rode toward the birds. The heat was brutal, air thick enough to chew. Red dust coated everything from his hat to his boots, and sweat dried to salt on his skin before it could even drip. The smell of sage and sun-baked earth filled his nostrils as he rode. The vultures scattered as he approached, rising on heavy wings to perch in a dead cottonwood nearby. They were patient creatures. They could wait. Whatever lay in that dirt was not going anywhere. What Cole found stopped his heart cold. Not a corpse. Something worse. A woman lay face down in the red dust. Her dress was torn to ribbons, her back a road map of scars and wounds. Some of the cuts were fresh, still weeping through the fabric. Others had long since healed to raised white lines, crisscrossing her skin like marks of a whip that had been used many times before. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, purple and black and yellow, the colors of bruises in various stages of healing. One eye was completely shut, the lid puffed up like a rotten plum. Finger-shaped bruises circled her throat like a necklace, the clear imprint of a man's hands where someone had squeezed hard enough to leave marks. Cole had seen dead bodies before, plenty of them. In his former life, he had brought in 47 men, some alive, some not. But this woman was not dead. She was not crawling either. Too weak for that now. Only her fingers moved, scratching at the dirt toward the sound of water she must have heard somewhere in the distance. Moving on pure animal instinct when everything human should have given up long ago. Her fingernails were broken, some still embedded in the ground where she had clawed her way forward inch by agonizing inch. Cole dismounted slow and easy the way you approach a wounded animal that might spook. He took stock of what he saw. This was not Indians. No signs of that kind of attack. This was not robbery either. She still wore an expensive ring on her finger, gold with a small stone that caught the dying light. This was someone who knew her, someone who wanted her to suffer. Ma'am. She flinched so hard her whole body spasmed, tried to move faster, collapsed face first into the dirt with a sound that was half sob and half moan. Easy now. I am not going to hurt you. Her one working eye found his face, gray-green like storm clouds over sage, like the sky before a tornado touches down. And in that eye he saw no fear, no pleading, no desperate hope for rescue. Just defiance. Pure, stubborn defiance that had no business being in someone so broken. She tried to speak. Her voice came out like sand and broken glass, scraped raw from screaming or thirst or both. Do not take me back. That stopped Cole in his tracks. She was not asking to be saved. She was not begging for help or mercy or water. She was asking not to be returned to whoever had done this to her. Please. Her eye held his. Do not take me back. Then she passed out. Cole stood there in the dying light, looking down at this woman whose name he did not know. Looking at the scars, old and new, that mapped her body like a chronicle of suffering. Looking at the way her fingers still twitched toward water, even in unconsciousness. He thought about walking away. He thought about the last time he had tried to help someone. About Jesse's face when they found him. About the bullet wound in his brother's back and the way Cole's world had cracked right down the middle. He had sworn after that day to never put himself in that position again. Sworn to stay out here alone until he died, or found a way to live with what had happened. Sworn that he would never again be responsible for another person's fate. But this woman, even now with nothing left, she had fought. Clawed her way through dirt and blood toward water she might never reach. Refused to give up even when giving up would have been so much easier. That kind of stubborn will deserved something. Respect, maybe, or at least the chance to die with a roof over her head and water in her belly. Cole bent down to lift her as gently as he could. That was when he saw her back clearly for the first time. Not just scars, not just wounds. Letters. Someone had carved letters into her skin, initials branded into her flesh like a rancher marks cattle. His jaw tightened until he thought his teeth might crack. She weighed nothing. Skin and bones and stubborn will wrapped in torn cotton. He could feel every rib beneath his hands, every sharp angle of a body that had been starved as well as beaten. Dust had followed him out from the ranch. The old hound stood over the spot where the woman had lain, whining low in his throat. When Cole lifted her onto his horse, the dog did not head back toward home. He lay down in the dirt and refused to move. "Old man," Cole said to the dog, "I hate when you are right." He swung up behind her and turned the mare toward home, cradling her broken body against his chest. Whatever trouble this woman carried, It was his trouble now. Evie woke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of boots on wooden boards. She did not move, did not open her eyes, did not let her breathing change even slightly from the slow rhythm of sleep. This was how she had survived 5 years with Silas Hartley, by being still, by being silent, by cataloging every threat in the room before showing she was awake. Old habits never die. Maybe they never die at all. She lay there beneath a rough wool blanket, taking inventory of her situation the way she had learned to do 1,000 mornings before. Her ribs ached with every breath, but nothing felt broken. The cuts on her back had been cleaned and bandaged with surprising care, the cloth strips wrapped firmly, but not too tight. Someone had changed her out of her ruined dress and into a man's cotton shirt, soft from many washings, large enough that it hung past her knees. She could hear a fire crackling outside, water bubbling in a pot somewhere, wind pushing against thin walls. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dog and horse, honest smells that held no trace of the expensive cologne Silas always wore. And those boots, steady footsteps moving across the floor, but moving away from her, not toward. That was different. That was new. Silas had always moved toward her when she was vulnerable. Evie risked opening her good eye. Just a crack, just enough to see. The cabin was small and spare. A single room with a cook stove in one corner, a rough-hewn table, 2 ladder-back chairs, a narrow bed that she currently occupied. Animal pelts hung on the walls for insulation. Books sat stacked on a shelf, their spines cracked from use. A saddle rested on a wooden stand near the window, well oiled and cared for. And on the wall by the door, a gun belt hung from a peg. A Colt revolver sat in the holster, covered in a fine layer of dust, like it had not been touched in years. The man had his back to her. He was outside now, visible through the open door, tall and lean with the kind of broad shoulders that came from honest work rather than vanity. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent outdoors. When he turned to check on something cooking over the fire, Evie saw the scar. It ran down his left cheek from just below his eye to the corner of his jaw, a raised white line that must have bled something terrible when it was fresh. The kind of wound you got from a knife, not a fall. The kind of wound you survived because you were lucky or skilled or both. He did not come inside. Instead, he ladled something from the pot into a bowl and brought it to the doorway, set it down on the threshold, then walked away without a word. He was giving her space, letting her decide when to trust him enough to eat. Evie waited 30 minutes before touching the bowl. Old habits. The broth was warm and salty. Rabbit, she thought, with some wild onion. Simple but nourishing. She drank it slowly, knowing her shrunken stomach could not handle much. When she finished, she took stock of herself more carefully. Her hidden items were still there. The ring and the map, sewn into the hem of what remained of her dress, which lay folded on a chair nearby. He had not searched her things, had not taken the evidence that could bring down an empire. Why not? The answer came to her slowly, reluctantly. Maybe he simply was not that kind of man. But everyone was that kind of man. Everyone wanted something. 5 years with Silas had taught her that lesson in blood and bruises. She thought back to the last time she had felt safe. Really safe. It was so long ago now, she could barely remember the sensation. The memories came unbidden. Her wedding night. Silas had been polite, gentle even. She had thought maybe it would not be so bad after all. Maybe marrying a man twice her age to save her father from debtor's prison was the right choice. Then he had sat down beside her on the bed and calmly explained the rules. She was his property now. Her job was to be beautiful, silent, and available whenever he wanted her. If she performed these duties well, she would live comfortably. If she did not, she would learn the consequences. 6 months later came her first escape attempt. She had planned it for weeks, saved money, memorized stage routes, thought she had been so careful. Silas did not beat her himself, of course not. He never dirtied his own hands. He had Miguel do it. She remembered that beating with terrible clarity. But she also remembered one detail that had puzzled her at the time. Miguel would not meet her eyes. Not once during the whole thing. First time in 3 years he had touched her, and he could not look. She filed that memory away with all the others, waiting for a time when it might be useful. Now here she was, alive when she should be dead, in a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere. The man returned as the sun was setting. He stood in the doorway, not entering, keeping his distance. "You are awake." Evie did not answer. Her throat was still too raw. He nodded like he understood. "There is more broth if you want it. Water in the pitcher. I will be outside if you need anything." He turned to go. "Who are you?" The words scraped out of her throat like gravel. The man paused. "Name is Cole Brennan. This is my ranch. Why? Why what? Why help me? You do not know what I am. What is coming for me?" Cole looked at her for a long moment. His face gave nothing away. "Does not matter what is coming. Right now you are here, and I do not leave people to die." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her fears, and the growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found someone who meant what he said. She did not believe it, could not afford to believe it. But the seed was planted all the same. That night, she had a nightmare. The same one she always had. Silas's face looming over her in the dark, his hands around her throat. His voice, soft and reasonable, explaining why she deserved what was about to happen. She woke, screaming. For a moment, she was back there, back in that house, back in that life. She scrambled against the headboard, pulling the blanket up like it could protect her from anything. Then she heard it. Footsteps on the porch, coming toward the door. She braced herself for whatever was next, for the anger, the punishment, the cold reminder that she had no right to disturb anyone's sleep with her noise. The footsteps stopped at the threshold. A quiet voice came from the darkness. "You need some water?" That was all. No anger, no punishment, just a question. Evie could not answer. Her throat had closed up entirely. After a moment, she heard the footsteps retreat. A few minutes later, a cup of water appeared on the doorstep, placed there without ceremony and left for her to take when she was ready. It was such a small thing. It broke something loose inside her that she had thought was gone forever. She did not sleep again that night. But for the first time in years, she did not spend the dark hours counting the minutes until dawn and dreading what it would bring. 3 days passed. Cole watched the woman heal, with the same patience he used on wild horses. You could not rush these things. Push too hard, and you would undo whatever progress you had made. The trick was consistency, showing up the same way every day. Proving through action rather than words that you could be trusted. She could walk now, though it clearly pained her. She helped around the cabin without being asked, swept the floor, washed the dishes, fed dust scraps from her plate. It was like watching someone try to pay off a debt they believed they owed. Cole recognized the behavior. He had done the same thing himself for years after Jesse died. He started teaching her things. Practical survival skills that did not require much talking. How to identify a rattlesnake den by the smell. How to find water in a barrel cactus without poisoning yourself. How to build a fire that made no smoke in case you did not want to be found. She learned fast. Faster than anyone he had ever taught. Like she had been waiting her whole life for someone to show her how to fight back instead of just endure. On the 3rd afternoon, she asked about his scar. Cole was sharpening a knife at the time. He did not look up. Gift from number 47. 47 what? Men I brought in. He tested the blade against his thumb. I was a ranger. Silence stretched between them. He could feel her watching him, measuring, trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. And the gun? She meant the Colt on the wall, the one covered in dust. Cole's hands went still on the whetstone. Guns are easy to fire. Living with what comes after is hard. He did not elaborate. She did not push. Later that day, she found the photograph. Cole had forgotten it was there, tucked into an old book of poetry that had belonged to his mother. A tintype from 8 years ago. Him in his ranger uniform, standing stiff and proud. Jesse beside him, younger by 3 years, wearing that easy smile that came so naturally to him. Jesse had always been the friendly one, the charming one, the one people liked right away. Cole was the silent one, the scary one, the one who got things done but never made friends doing it. She did not ask about the photograph, just looked at it for a long moment, then put it back exactly where she had found it. Smart woman. She knew when not to push. That evening, riders came. Cole heard them before he saw them. 2 horses moving fast from the south. He was in the corral working with Diablo when the sound reached him. "Get inside," he told the woman. "Do not come out until I say." She did not argue, just slipped into the cabin and closed the door. The riders came around the bend and pulled up short when they saw Cole standing in the middle of the trail. 2 men in dusty clothes, wearing guns like they knew how to use them. One had a scar on his neck that Cole recognized. The kind of mark rangers left on prisoners they had to subdue hard. "Help you boys with something?" The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a red face, smiled without warmth. "Looking for someone. A woman. Run off from her husband up in Thornfield. There is a reward for bringing her back. Have not seen any women around here. Mind if we look around?" Cole did not move. "I do mind, actually." The red-faced man's smile faded. "Mister, we are just doing our job. The woman is property of Judge Silas Hartley. He wants her returned." "That's so?" "That is so." The rider leaned forward in his saddle. $500 for her. Alive. The judge wants to deal with her himself. Cole felt something cold settle in his gut. Silas Hartley. The name he had been waiting 6 years to hear again. "Well," he said slowly, "I have not seen any woman matching that description. But if I do, I will be sure to let you know." The riders exchanged a look. They did not believe him. But they also saw the corral full of wild horses, the dusty colt that had not been touched in years, the solitary setup of a man who clearly wanted to be left alone, not exactly the profile of someone harboring a runaway. "We will be back," the red-faced man said. "If you are lying to us, it will go badly for you. I am sure it will." They rode off without another word. Cole waited until they were out of sight before walking to the cabin. The woman was standing just inside the door, her face pale. "They are looking for you." "I know. Silas Hartley sent them." "I know." Cole studied her face. She looked like someone who had just heard a death sentence, but her chin was up and her eyes were steady. "Tell me about him," Cole said. "Tell me everything." The words came slowly at first, haltingly, like she was not used to anyone actually listening. "His name is Silas Hartley. He is a judge in Thornfield. Has been for 15 years. Everyone thinks he is a good man. Pillar of the community, donates to churches, sits on charitable boards. But that is not who he really is." Her voice hardened. "He is a land grabber, uses the law to steal from settlers, manipulates deeds, calls in debts, bankrupts families who have worked their land for generations, then buys their property for pennies on the dollar. And those who will not sell? They have accidents. Indian attacks, barn fires that spread to the house while everyone is sleeping." She met his eyes. "He has killed dozens of people, Cole, and no one knows because he is so careful, so respectable." Cole's hands had curled into fists without him realizing it. "Hartley is the man my brother worked for," he said quietly. "Before my brother died." Her face changed. "What?" "Jesse. My younger brother. He was investigating Hartley 6 years ago. Got a tip about something. Went to check it out alone. He was shot in the back." She was silent for a long moment. Then she said the only thing that mattered. "I am sorry. Do not be sorry." Just tell me what you have on him." She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out 2 items. The first was a gold wedding ring. She held it up to the dying light. "Look inside." Cole took the ring and tilted it. There, engraved on the inner band, was a name: Elizabeth Harmon. "That was the first person he killed," she said. "At least the first one I know about. She died of a fever, everyone was told. But I found letters in his office. She was going to expose him for something, so he had her poisoned. And you kept the ring. He gave it to me on our wedding night, told me it had belonged to his mother." She laughed bitterly. "I did not learn the truth until years later, but once I knew, I kept it." Evidence. What else? She unfolded a piece of paper, a hand-drawn map marked with locations throughout the territory. "These are burial sites, mass graves where bodies were buried, settlers who disappeared, people who stood in his way. I have been to 3 of them myself. The bodies are there." Cole stared at the map. All those little marks, all those lives ended by one man's greed. "Why did you keep this? Why not destroy it and run?" "Because I had a sister once." The words hung in the air between them. Her name was Margaret. She married a farmer out near Dry Creek. They had 40 acres and a future. Then Hartley decided he wanted their land for a railroad spur. Cole waited. They lost everything. The law said Hartley owned their property due to some paper they had never signed. Margaret and her husband tried to fight it. He died in a barn fire. She died 2 years later in a charity ward in Austin, starved to death while I was living in luxury in Hartley's house. Her voice cracked. "She is one of the names on this map, her husband too. They are buried in a ravine 3 miles from where their farm used to be." "I am sorry." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Do not be sorry. Help me destroy him." Cole looked at the map again, at the ring in his hand, at this woman who had survived 5 years of hell and still had fight left in her. He thought about Jesse, about the note they had found in his brother's pocket, about all the years Cole had spent hiding in this canyon while Hartley walked free. "What is your name?" She hesitated, then decided to trust him. "Evangeline Evie McAllister. At least that was my name before I became Mrs. Silas Hartley." "Well, Evie McAllister." He handed her back the ring and the map. "I think it is time I stopped hiding." The next morning Ruth arrived. Cole heard the wagon before he saw it. His sister had a heavy hand with horses, always had. She drove them hard and complained when they got tired, never quite understanding that not everything in the world would bend to her will. But she was the only family he had left now, the only person who knew where to find him, the only one he trusted enough to let into his canyon. She pulled up in front of the cabin and set the brake with more force than necessary. Her eyes went straight to Evie, who was standing in the doorway with a cup of water in her hand. "So," Ruth said flatly, "you found yourself some trouble after all? Ruth, this is Evie. Evie, my sister Ruth." Ruth climbed down from the wagon, her practical skirt swishing against her boots. She was 4 years younger than Cole, but life had aged her. Widowed at 25 when her husband died of fever, raising 2 children alone while running the only way station within 50 miles. She walked straight up to Evie and looked her over with the kind of appraising stare that missed nothing. "Those bruises are about a week old. The cuts on your back are healing clean, so someone knew what they were doing with the bandages." She glanced at Cole. "You always did have gentle hands." "She is running from Silas Hartley," Cole said. Ruth's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I know who she is running from. Word came through the station 2 days ago. They are showing her picture all over the territory. $500 for her return. Alive." Evie's face went pale. "You came to warn us," Cole said. "I came to talk sense into you." Ruth folded her arms. There are bounty hunters asking questions everywhere. Hartley has men in every town from here to Mexico. And you, brother, are hiding in a canyon that only has one entrance. What would you have me do? I would have you use the brain God gave you. Ruth turned to Evie. No offense to you, miss. You look like you have been through hell and back. But my brother has spent 6 years hiding from the world, and I will not let him get killed over something that is not his fight. It is my fight, Cole said quietly. Ruth stared at him. Hartley killed Jesse. Cole's voice was flat, but his hands were shaking. The tip Jesse was following 6 years ago. It led to Hartley. Jesse died because he got too close to the truth. Silence fell over the three of them. Finally, Ruth spoke. You never told me that. I was not sure. Not until now. He nodded toward Evie. She has evidence. Names. Locations. Enough to bring him down. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer. What do you need from me? Time. Cole looked at Evie. We need a few more days. She is not healed enough to travel yet. There are bounty hunters sniffing around the territory, Ruth said. How long until they find this canyon? That is the gamble. Ruth shook her head slowly. You always were too stubborn for your own good. She pulled a bundle from the wagon. Supplies, food, medicine, clothes that will actually fit her. She tossed the bundle to Cole, then climbed back onto the wagon. 2 days, she said. I can maybe keep them pointed in the wrong direction for 2 days. After that, you need to be gone. Thank you. Do not thank me. Just do not get killed. She picked up the reins, then paused. And Cole? Yes? That gun on your wall. Her eyes met his. It might be time to clean the dust off it. She drove away without waiting for an answer. That evening, Cole and Evie sat on the porch watching the sun go down. Dust lay between them, his old head resting on his paws, tail wagging slowly. Your sister does not trust me, Evie said. My sister does not trust anyone. It is how she has survived this long. She is right, though. This is not your fight. You could just let me go, point me toward Mexico, and forget you ever saw me. Cole did not answer right away. He was watching the colors bleed across the sky, red and gold and purple, the kind of sunset that made you feel small and temporary. I spent 6 years pretending Jesse's death did not matter, he said finally, telling myself there was nothing I could do, that Hartley was too powerful, too connected, too smart to be brought down by someone like me. And now I have a chance to make it right. He turned to look at her. I am not doing this just for you. I need you to understand that. I am doing it for Jesse, for all the people buried in those graves you marked on your map. Evie was quiet for a moment. What happened to him? Your brother? Cole's jaw tightened. Jesse was always the trusting one. The one who believed people were basically good. He got a tip about Hartley from someone. Never told me who. Said he had proof that Hartley was behind the land grabs, the murders, all of it. He went alone? I told him to wait. Told him we should go together, do it by the book. But Jesse was impatient. He wanted to be the hero, wanted to prove himself. Cole's voice roughened. I found him in a ravine 2 days later, shot in the back, the coward's way. Whoever did it did not even have the guts to face him. Do you know who pulled the trigger? No. But I have always suspected someone sold him out. Someone told Hartley that Jesse was coming. Who? Our captain. Man named Wade Hollister. I saw him take money from Hartley once, an envelope with Hartley's seal on it. I never could prove anything, but I have hated him ever since. Evie was silent for a long moment. What will you do when you find out the truth? Cole looked at the Colt hanging on the wall inside the cabin, the dust that covered it like a shroud. I do not know, he said honestly. I have not fired that gun in 6 years. Every time I pick it up, I see Jesse's face, The way he looked when I found him. You are afraid you will not be able to pull the trigger when it matters. I am afraid of a lot of things. Cole finally met her eyes. But I am more afraid of spending the rest of my life hiding while men like Hartley walk free. Evie reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily. The first time she had reached for anyone in years. And the simple act of it, the trust it represented, made something shift in Cole's chest. "Then we will face him together," she said. Cole did not pull away, did not speak. Just sat there in the fading light, holding the hand of a woman he barely knew, feeling something long frozen inside him begin to thaw. That night, Evie could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything Cole had told her. About Jesse. About Wade. About the years of guilt and grief that had driven him to this canyon. She understood that kind of pain. Carried her own version of it. Margaret's face swam before her in the darkness. Her little sister, always laughing, always hopeful, always believing that tomorrow would be better than today. Margaret had believed in Evie, had written letters full of encouragement when Evie first married Hartley, had refused to see anything wrong even when Evie tried to warn her. And then, Hartley had taken everything from her. And Margaret had died alone in a charity ward while Evie sat in silk dresses and ate off china plates. The guilt of that would never leave her. But maybe if she could bring Hartley down, it would at least mean something. Margaret's death would not be in vain. She heard movement outside the cabin, quiet footsteps on the porch. Cole was standing by the railing looking out at the stars. He did not turn when she came through the door. "Could not sleep," he said. It was not a question. No. They stood together in silence for a while. The night was cool, the sky vast and dark and full of distant light. Evie found herself looking at the scar on his cheek. In the moonlight, it stood out sharply, a pale line against weathered skin. "Tell me about the 47, she said. Cole's mouth quirked slightly. "Not much to tell. I was a ranger for 12 years. Brought in a lot of bad men. And the scar? Number 47 was a knife fighter from Sonora. He cut me before I got the drop on him. Did you kill him?" "No." Cole's voice was quiet. "I never killed anyone I brought in. That was my rule. Justice should come from the courts, not from my gun." "Is that why you stopped?" "I stopped because my brother died, and I could not save him. I stopped because the man I believed was responsible walked free, and I was not allowed to do anything about it." He turned to look at her. "I stopped because I was afraid that if I kept wearing that badge, I would become something I did not want to be. A killer instead of a lawman. Someone who took justice into his own hands because the system had failed." Evie thought about that for a long moment. "And now? Now, I do not know what I am." Cole's eyes were dark in the moonlight. "But I know what I want to be. I want to be the kind of man who sees something wrong and does something about it, even if it scares him, even if it costs him everything." He reached out and touched her face. Gentle, careful, like she was something precious that might break. "You saved yourself, Evie. You walked out of hell on your own 2 feet. All I did was find you at the end of the road." "You did more than that," she whispered. "You made me believe there might be something worth walking toward." The air between them went still. Then Cole dropped his hand and stepped back. "You should get some rest," he said. "We have a long journey ahead of us." He was right. She knew he was right. But as she walked back into the cabin, she could still feel the warmth of his touch on her cheek. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever happened next, she would not be facing it alone. The next morning, Cole took the gun down from the wall. He held it in his hands for a long time, feeling its weight. The leather of the holster was stiff from disuse. The metal of the barrel was cold despite the warmth of the day. 6 years since he had touched this weapon. 6 years since he had sworn never to draw it again. Evie watched him from the doorway but said nothing. Cole sat down at the table and began to clean the gun. The movements came back to him automatically. Remove the cylinder, check for obstructions, clean the barrel with oil and cloth. Work the action until it moved smooth as butter. His hands did not shake. That surprised him. "You're going to wear it," Evie said. "It was not a question. I am going to be ready. Whether I actually use it remains to be seen." He finished cleaning and loaded the cylinder. 6 rounds. Then he strapped on the gun belt for the first time in 6 years. The weight of it felt strange, like putting on a piece of himself he had tried to forget. "Tell me more about Hartley's operation," he said. "Everything you know." They spent the morning going over details, the land deals, the bought judges, the network of enforcers who carried out the dirty work while Hartley kept his hands clean. "There is a man named Miguel," Evie said. "He is Hartley's right hand, does most of the wet work. Describe him." "Half Mexican, half Irish. Grew up on the streets of El Paso. He is the one who beat me when Hartley wanted me punished." Cole's jaw tightened. "But there is something strange," Evie continued. "The last time he touched me, when he left me in the desert, he would not meet my eyes. It was like he could not bear to look at what he was doing. Maybe he has a conscience buried somewhere. Maybe. Or maybe he has his own reasons for staying loyal to Hartley. Things I do not understand yet." Cole filed that information away. A man with doubts could be useful. Who else? "There is a marshal named Wade Hollister. He used to work with the Rangers. Now he travels with Hartley sometimes." Cole went very still. "Wade Hollister? You know him?" "He was my captain." Cole's voice was flat. "The one I suspected of selling out Jesse." Evie's eyes widened. "Cole, if he is traveling with Hartley now, then he is either still on Hartley's payroll or he is playing a deeper game." Cole stood up and walked to the window. "Either way, I will find out." That afternoon, riders came again. Cole heard them long before they reached the canyon entrance. More than 2 this time. Maybe 4 or 5. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the high ground above the canyon mouth. Evie followed without being asked. From their vantage point, they could see the riders approaching. 4 men on horseback, moving with the easy confidence of people who expected no resistance. But they were not heading for the canyon. They were meeting someone. Cole squinted against the sun. A 5th rider was coming from the opposite direction. Alone. Moving slowly. "Can you see who it is?" Evie whispered. "Not yet." The 5 riders converged in the flat below the canyon. They spoke for a few minutes. Then the lone rider handed over something. A piece of paper, maybe, or money. Cole's blood went cold. He recognized the lone rider now, the set of the shoulders, the way he sat his horse. "Wade Hollister." "What is he doing?" Evie breathed. "Good question." They watched as Wade and the 4 men talked for another minute. Then Wade turned his horse and rode away toward the east. The other 4 split up, 2 heading north and 2 heading south. They were not coming to the canyon. Not yet. But they were clearly looking for something. Or someone. "We need to move," Cole said. "Tonight." They packed quickly. Food, water, weapons. The evidence Evie had been carrying. Cole saddled his mare and a second horse for Evie. The black stallion Diablo watched from the corral, ears pricked forward. On impulse, Cole opened the gate and let him out. "Go on," he said. "Be free." Diablo tossed his head and trotted a few steps away. Then he stopped, turned back, looked at Cole with those wild eyes. "I am not taking you," Cole said. "Where I am going, I might not come back." The stallion did not move. Cole shook his head and swung up onto his mare. "Suit yourself." They rode out as the sun was setting. Behind them, unasked and unhurried, Diablo followed. Night fell over the Devil's Spine. The mountains lived up to their name. Sharp ridges that cut the sky like broken glass. Trails so narrow that one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling into the darkness below. They traveled single file. Cole in front, Evie behind him, Diablo bringing up the rear like a ghost who refused to be left behind. The air grew thin and cold as they climbed. Wolf howls echoed through the canyons, multiplying until it sounded like there were dozens of them. Cole had made this journey before years ago when he was still a ranger. The Devil's Spine was the fastest route to Thornfield if you did not mind the risk of dying along the way. Around midnight, they stopped in a shallow cave to rest the horses. Evie was shivering despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset. Cole built a small fire, just enough to take the edge off the cold without advertising their position. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will keep watch. I am not tired. Yes, you are. You're just too stubborn to admit it." She smiled at that. Just barely. The first smile he had seen from her. Takes one to know one. Cole sat down across from her, his back to the cave wall, his rifle across his knees. "Tell me about your life," she said. "Before all this, before Jesse." "Not much to tell. I was a ranger. I brought in bad men. I thought that was enough." "It sounds lonely." It was. Cole stared into the fire. "Jesse was the only person I really talked to. He was the one who made friends, told jokes, knew how to put people at ease. I just did my job and went home." "What about your sister?" "Ruth is Ruth. She has her own life, her own problems. After Jesse died, I pulled away from everyone. Thought it would be easier that way." "Was it?" "No." Cole met her eyes. It was just quiet. They were silent for a while. The fire crackled between them. "I used to dream about escaping," Evie said softly. "Every night for 5 years. I would lie awake planning how to get out, where to go, who might help me. And every morning I would wake up and realize it was impossible. What changed?" She looked down at her hands, the scars on her wrists from struggles she did not like to talk about. "2 years ago I tried to kill him, poison in his wine, but I did not give him enough. He got sick, but he did not die." She laughed bitterly. "I was too much of a coward to use a larger dose. Too afraid of what would happen if it did not work. That is not cowardice. That is survival." "Maybe. But it cost me." She touched her back where the carved letters hid beneath her shirt. "He knew it was me. He made sure I would never forget. The punishment." "Yes." She finally met his eyes. "He did not have them carve his own initials. He had them carve my sister's. Margaret. To remind me every day that my failure killed her." Cole's hands clenched into fists. "That is not true. It feels true. Every time I look in a mirror." Cole moved closer to her, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She did not. He reached out and touched her face. The bruises had faded to yellow now, but he could still see them beneath the surface. "Your sister did not die because of you. She died because a monster decided her life was worth less than his profit. That is on him, not you." Tears slipped down Evie's cheeks. "I could not save her. You could not save her then." Cole's voice was steady. "But you can make sure she is remembered. You can make sure he pays for what he did." She leaned into his touch, just slightly, just enough. "Will you help me?" Until the end. They stayed like that for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, just two broken people finding comfort in each other's presence. Then Evie pulled back and wiped her eyes. "We should get moving. We should." Cole stood up and offered her his hand. "But first there is something I need to tell you." "What?" "That day in the desert, when I found you." He helped her to her feet. "You bit my hand." Evie looked confused. "I do not remember that." "I know. But I want you to know that even then, half dead and out of your mind with pain, you were still fighting. Still refusing to give up." He squeezed her hand. "That is who you are, Evie McAllister. Not a victim, a survivor." She stood there in the firelight, looking up at him with those gray-green eyes. Then she did something that surprised them both. She rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, tentative, over almost before it began, but it changed everything. "I am sorry," she whispered, pulling back. "I should not have done that." Cole caught her hand before she could turn away. "Do not apologize." He pulled her close and kissed her properly, slowly, thoroughly, like they had all the time in the world instead of a death sentence hanging over their heads. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "We have to go," Cole said. "I know. This does not change anything about the plan. I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. "But when this is over, if we are both still alive, there are things I want to say to you." Evie smiled. That almost smile that made her whole face change. "I will hold you to that." They mounted up and rode into the darkness. Behind them, the fire died to embers. Ahead of them, dawn was breaking over Thornfield. They reached the way station by noon. Ruth met them at the door with a rifle in her hands and fire in her eyes. "Someone is inside," she said quietly. "Been waiting for you since yesterday." "Who?" "Says his name is Wade Hollister." Cole's hand went to his gun. "He came alone. No weapon visible. Says he needs to talk to you." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "I do not like him, Cole. There is something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe. Keep Evie out here." Cole walked through the door alone. Wade Hollister sat at Ruth's table, a cup of cold coffee in front of him. He looked older than Cole remembered, more worn. The years had not been kind. Cole, Wade. They stared at each other across the room. 6 years of silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. "I know what you think of me," Wade said finally. "I know what you believe I did. Then you know why I am about to kill you." Wade did not flinch. "Maybe I deserve it. But before you pull that trigger, there is something you need to see." He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, held it out. Cole did not move. "Please," Wade said. "Just look at it." Against his better judgment, Cole took the paper, unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, painfully familiar. "I found proof. Meet me at San Miguel tomorrow night." "Jesse." "Where did you get this?" "It was in my saddlebag." Wade's voice was rough. "Jesse must have left it there before he went to meet whoever he was meeting. I did not find it until after he was dead." Cole's hands were shaking. "You had this for 6 years. 6 years, Wade. And you never told me. Because I did not know what to do with it. Because I was afraid." Wade stood up slowly. "I took money from Hartley, Cole, 6 years ago. He said it was just to look the other way on some land deals. I thought it was harmless. You thought it was harmless. I was wrong." Wade's voice cracked. "When Jesse died, I understood. I had been used. That money was payment for information. Information that got your brother killed." Cole drew his gun. Wade did not move. "I have spent 6 years trying to make it right," he said. 6 years gathering evidence against Hartley. Every deal, every bribe, every murder I could connect him to. Why should I believe you? Because of this." Wade reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out a thick envelope, held it out. Cole took it. Inside was a stack of papers. Transaction records, witness statements, maps with locations marked. 6 years of evidence, Wade said. Everything I could find without getting myself killed. Combined with what your woman has, it might be enough to bring him down." "My woman?" "The McAllister woman. I know she is here. I know she has evidence too. And I know Hartley is looking for both of you." Cole lowered his gun slightly. "There is a federal inspection team coming to Texas," Wade continued, "arriving in 2 weeks. If we can get this evidence to them, Hartley will be investigated, maybe even arrested. And you expect me to trust you?" "No." Wade met his eyes. "I expect you to use me. I am the only one who knows Hartley's operation from the inside. I know where his men are stationed. I know his schedules, his habits, his weaknesses." Cole stared at the man he had hated for 6 years. The envelope in his hands was heavy. full of evidence that had taken years to gather, evidence that could finally bring down the man who had killed his brother. But Wade was also the reason Jesse had died. The reason Cole had spent 6 years alone in a canyon, running from his past. Could he trust a traitor to help him find justice? There was only one way to find out. Cole holstered his gun. "Tell me everything." That night, around Ruth's table, they laid out the plan. Wade went first. Hartley has 50 men at his disposal. 20 are permanent guards at his estate. The rest are scattered across the territory, watching roads and towns. "What about the law?" Evie asked. "Hartley owns the sheriff. Most of the deputies, too." Wade shook his head. "Any lawman who is not on his payroll is too scared to move against him." "What about higher up?" "That is where the inspectors come in. They answer to Austin, not to the local authorities. If we can give them solid evidence, they will be legally bound to investigate." Cole studied the map spread out before them. "When do the inspectors arrive?" 2 weeks. They are starting in San Antonio and working their way west. That gives us time to prepare. It also gives Hartley time to find us." Wade glanced at Evie. "He has doubled the reward for your return, $1,000 now. Every bounty hunter in the territory is looking for you." Evie's face was pale but determined. "Then we need to stop hiding." She stood up straight. "I want to confront him, publicly, where everyone can see." Cole stared at her. "That is suicide." "No." She shook her head. "That is the one thing he cannot handle. His reputation is everything to him. If I accuse him in front of the whole town, he will have to respond. And whatever he does, people will see who he really is." "She will be exposed," Wade said. "Vulnerable." "I am already exposed." Evie's voice was steady. "I have been vulnerable my whole marriage. At least this way it will be my choice." Silence fell over the table. Ruth spoke first. "She is right." Everyone looked at her. "Hartley's power comes from fear and secrecy," Ruth said. "As long as he controls the narrative, he is untouchable. But if someone stands up to him publicly, if someone forces him to show his true face, the spell breaks." "And then what?" Cole asked. "And then people see that he is just a man." Ruth's eyes were hard. "A cruel, petty, vicious man who beats his wife and kills his neighbors." Cole looked at Evie. "You understand what you are asking. If you confront him publicly, there is no going back. Even if we survive, your life will never be the same. My life was never mine to begin with." Evie met his eyes. "This is my chance to take it back." Cole held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. "All right. We do it your way." He turned to Wade. "How much time do we need to prepare?" "A week. Maybe less if we push hard. Then let us get started." They talked late into the night. Strategy, timing, contingencies for everything that could go wrong. When the others finally went to bed, Cole and Evie sat alone on Ruth's porch, watching the stars. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Terrified." "Good." Cole looked at her. "Brave people are not the ones without fear. They are the ones who act despite it." Evie smiled slightly. "Did you read that in a book?" "No. Jesse said it to me once, right before we went after a gang of bank robbers. He was shaking so hard he could barely hold his gun. But he went anyway." "What happened?" "We got them." Cole's voice softened. "Jesse was shot in the leg, spent 2 months limping around and complaining about it, but he never regretted going." Evie was quiet for a moment. "You miss him?" "Every day." She reached out and took his hand. "I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you." Cole squeezed her fingers. He always did have a weakness for stubborn women. Evie laughed. A real laugh this time. The first one Cole had heard from her. "Lucky for you, then. Lucky for me." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the night sky turn slowly toward dawn. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to Thornfield. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, for just a few hours, they could pretend they were normal people living normal lives. It was enough. The journey took 3 days. They traveled by night, following trails that only Cole and Wade knew. Narrow canyons and box arroyos where horses had to pick their way carefully, and a small group could stay hidden from larger forces. Diablo followed without being asked. The wild stallion who had refused to be broken now refused to be left behind. On the second night, they were ambushed. Cole saw them first. 4 riders blocking the trail ahead. Silhouettes against the stars, guns already drawn. Down. They dismounted and took cover behind a rock formation. Cole's rifle was in his hands before his feet hit the ground. "How many?" Wade whispered. 4. Maybe more in the rocks. Can we go around? Not without losing hours. Cole studied the terrain. They picked a good spot. Only way through is past them. Then we fight. Wait. Cole was watching one of the riders. The man had shifted, presenting his back as he scanned the darkness in the wrong direction. A clean shot. An easy kill, if Cole was willing to take it. His finger tightened on the trigger. Through the sight, he could see the man's back clearly. One pull and the fight would be over before it started. But Jesse had been shot in the back, the coward's way. The one thing Cole had sworn he would never do. He shifted his aim, fired at a rock near the rider's horse instead. The animal spooked and threw its rider. The other 3 turned toward the sound, giving away their positions. "Now!" Cole shouted. Wade and Evie opened fire from cover. 2 of the riders went down. The 3rd wheeled his horse and fled into the darkness. The 4th, the one Cole had spooked, was scrambling for his gun when Cole reached him. "Do not move." The man froze. "Who sent you?" "Go to hell." Cole pressed the rifle barrel against the man's forehead. "Last chance, Hartley." Ants. The name came out in a gasp. "Judge Hartley. He is paying $50 a head for anyone who helps find the woman." Cole lowered the rifle. "Get on your horse and ride. Tell your friends they picked the wrong fight." The man scrambled to obey. In seconds, he was nothing but hoofbeats fading into the night. "Why did you let him go?" Evie demanded. Cole did not answer right away. He was looking at the 2 bodies on the ground. Men he had killed. The first men he had killed in over 6 years. His hands were steady. His heart was calm. He did not know if that was a good thing or not. "We should move," he said finally. "More will come." They rode hard until dawn. By the time they stopped to rest, Evie was barely able to stay in the saddle. Cole helped her down, pretending not to notice how heavily she leaned on him. "You need sleep. I need to keep moving. Sleep first." Cole guided her to a sheltered spot beneath an overhang. "Then we keep moving." She was asleep almost before she lay down. Cole sat beside her, keeping watch, thinking about the shot he had not taken, the man's back in his sights, the easy kill he had refused. His code had almost gotten them killed. If Evie had been hurt because of his principles, he never would have forgiven himself. But shooting a man in the back would have made him no different from whoever had killed Jesse. And that was a line he could not cross, not even for her. Evie woke a few hours later. "You did not sleep." "I am fine. You are lying." She sat up and looked at him. "Tell me what is bothering you." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Back there, during the fight, I had a clear shot at one of them, from behind. You did not take it." "No." Cole's jaw tightened. "My code. The thing I promised myself I would never do. And you think you should have. I think you could have died because I would not pull the trigger." Evie considered this. "But you saved us anyway. Found another way. This time." Cole met her eyes. "What about next time?" She moved closer to him, took his hand. "Then we will find another way next time too. You do not understand. This is not about being noble or righteous. It is about who I am. If I shoot men in the back, I become something else. Something I do not want to be." Evie squeezed his fingers. "I understand better than you think. She lifted his hand and pressed it against the scars on her back, hidden beneath her shirt. I was carved up because I tried to fight back. I could have been a good little wife and avoided all of this, but that would have meant becoming someone I was not. She met his eyes. Your code is not a weakness, Cole. It is what makes you different from them. And that is exactly why you are the right person to bring Hartley down. Cole stared at her. You really believe that? I really do. He pulled her close, held her against his chest, breathed in the smell of her hair, dust and sage, and something uniquely hers. When this is over, he said quietly, when Hartley is finished, and we are both still breathing, I want to build something real. Evie pulled back to look at his face. What kind of something? I do not know yet. A ranch, a family, a life that does not involve running or hiding or looking over our shoulders? He touched her cheek. A life with you. Evie's eyes were bright. Is that a proposal? It is a promise. The proposal comes later, when I can do it properly. She laughed, that almost laugh that he was growing to love. I will hold you to that too. They kissed, slow and sweet and full of things neither of them could say out loud yet. Then they mounted up and rode toward Thornfield. On the third day, someone found them first. Cole heard the hoofbeats and drew his gun. Beside him, Wade did the same. A single rider emerged from the scrub, a man on a dusty horse, hands raised to show he was unarmed. Cole recognized him immediately. Miguel Delgado, Hartley's enforcer. The man who had beaten Evie. The man who had carved those letters into her back. Cole's finger tightened on the trigger. Wait! Miguel's voice was hoarse, like he had been riding hard for days. Wait! I am not here to fight. Then why are you here? To warn you. Miguel slowly lowered his hands. Hartley knows you are coming. He has men stationed at every entrance to Thornfield. And you expect us to believe you? No. Miguel's eyes found Evie. I expect her to believe me. Evie moved her horse forward. You beat me, she said coldly. Left me in the desert to die. I did. Miguel did not flinch from her gaze. And I will burn in hell for it. But I also left you near water instead of deep desert. I gave you a chance. Why would you do that? Because Hartley lied to me. He said he saved my sister Rosa 5 years ago, said he kept her safe. Miguel's voice cracked. I found out last week she has been locked in his wine cellar the whole time. A prisoner. To keep me loyal. Cole watched the man's face. The guilt written there, the rage barely contained. How do we know this is not a trap? You do not. Miguel turned to face him. All I can tell you is that I am done being Hartley's dog. I want to see him fall, and I am willing to die to make it happen. Long silence. Evie spoke first. I believe him. Cole stared at her. He beat you bloody. I know. But I also know what it is like to be trapped by that man, to do things you hate because you have no choice. She looked at Miguel. If his sister is really being held prisoner, I understand why he did what he did. That does not make it right. No. But it makes it human. Cole considered this, looked at Miguel, at the man who had caused Evie so much pain, and saw something he recognized. The look of someone who had finally found the courage to fight back against a monster. You said Hartley has men at every entrance, Cole said. Do you know a way around them? Maybe. There is a trail through the old silver mine. It comes out behind the church. Can you lead us there? Miguel nodded. Will you trust me that far? Cole glanced at Evie. At Wade. At the wild stallion Diablo who had chosen to follow them without being asked. I will trust you until you give me a reason not to. After that, I will kill you myself. Fair enough. They rode on together, an unlikely alliance united by hatred of a common enemy. Ahead of them, Thornfield waited. They reached the edge of town at dusk. Thornfield was larger than Cole remembered. More buildings, more people, More of the false prosperity that came from being under the protection of a powerful man. Everything looked clean and orderly on the surface. Fresh paint on the storefronts. Well-maintained streets. Ladies in fine dresses walking arm in arm with gentlemen in tailored suits. But underneath it all was rot. Cole could smell it like you could smell a body buried in shallow ground. The whole town was built on blood and lies. "Look," Evie whispered. She was pointing at the welcome arch at the entrance to town. A banner hung there, bright red letters against white cloth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hartley." Hartley knew they were coming. He had turned Evie's return into a public event. "That son of a bitch," Wade muttered. "It is actually perfect." Evie's voice was steady. "He wants a show? We will give him one." They circled around through the silver mine trail that Miguel had promised. It was narrow and dark, the kind of passage that made horses nervous, but it brought them out exactly where he said it would. Behind the old San Miguel mission, the abandoned church where Jesse was supposed to have met Cole 6 years ago. The irony was not lost on anyone. "Wait here," Cole said. "I will scout ahead. I am coming with you." "Evie, this is my fight." She swung down from her horse. "I will not hide while you face him alone." Cole wanted to argue, wanted to lock her somewhere safe until this was all over, but he knew that was not who she was. And it was not who he loved. "All right, stay close." They crept through the gathering darkness to the edge of the town square. The whole population of Thornfield seemed to be gathered there. Hundreds of people milling around, waiting for something to happen. Torches had been lit, casting flickering shadows across expectant faces. And in the center of it all, standing on a raised platform like a preacher about to deliver a sermon, was Silas Hartley. Cole had not seen the man in 6 years. He had not changed much. Still tall, still distinguished, still wearing that mask of respectability that had fooled everyone for so long. Citizens of Thornfield. His voice carried across the square, rich and smooth as honey poured over broken glass. "Many of you know that my wife has been missing these past weeks, taken from our home by outlaws and criminals who sought to use her against me." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I am here to tell you that she has been found. My beloved Evangeline is coming home tonight." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "The men who took her have filled her head with lies," Hartley continued. "They have twisted her mind and turned her against her own family. But I forgive her. A man must forgive his wife her weaknesses." Cole felt Evie tense beside him. He opened his arms wide. "Evangeline, my darling, I know you are out there. I know you can hear me. Come home. Let me help you. Let me take care of you the way I always have." The crowd waited. Evie stepped out of the shadows. A gasp went through the gathered people as they recognized her. Not the beautiful, polished wife they remembered, a battered woman in borrowed clothes, with bruises fading on her face and fire in her eyes. She walked straight toward the platform. Hartley's smile never wavered. He came down to meet her, arms still open, playing his part perfectly. "My darling, you are home." Evie stopped 3 feet in front of him. Then she pulled down her shawl, revealing the bruises on her throat. The finger-shaped marks that could only have come from one thing. The crowd went silent. "Is this how you welcome me home, Silas?" Hartley's smile flickered. Just for a second. Then the mask was back in place. "My poor dear, what have they done to you? Do you want to see what else they did?" Evie turned and pulled down the collar of her dress, showing the top of the carved letters on her back. "This is not what outlaws did," she said loudly. "This is what you did. You ordered your man to carve your brand into me like I was cattle." She turned back to face him. "You beat me, starved me, locked me in my room for weeks at a time, and when I finally found the courage to leave, you had me dragged into the desert and left to die." "Lies," Hartley said smoothly. "My wife is ill. She has always been prone to delusions. These wounds are self-inflicted." A man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, a doctor in a formal coat. As her physician, I can confirm that Mrs. Hartley suffers from hysteria. Everything she is saying is a product of her diseased mind. Some people in the crowd nodded. Others looked uncertain. Evie reached into her dress and pulled out the ring. Then, explain this. She held it up to the torchlight. Elizabeth Harmon. That is the name engraved inside this ring. She died of fever, everyone was told. But I have letters that prove my husband had her poisoned because she knew too much about his business dealings. She looked out at the crowd. Who here remembers Elizabeth Harmon? Silence. Then a woman near the back started crying. An older woman, gray-haired and frail, supported by a younger man who might be her son. Elizabeth was my sister, the woman said, her voice trembling. She died in her sleep 15 years ago. We always thought something was wrong. The way it happened, the way he made us bury her so quickly. More murmurs now, more doubt. Evie produced the map, and this shows where the bodies are buried. Settlers who refused to sell their land. Families who stood in my husband's way. I have been to 3 of these sites myself. The graves are real. She threw the map at Hartley's feet. Check them, dig them up, count the bones. Then tell me again that I am delusional. The crowd was restless now. People looking at each other, looking at Hartley, seeing something they had not seen before. Or maybe something they had always seen but refused to acknowledge. Hartley stepped toward Evie, close enough that only she could hear. You were the most beautiful thing I ever owned, he whispered. Why did you have to ruin it? Evie met his eyes without flinching. I was never yours to own. He hit her, not hard, not the brutal beating he was capable of, just a backhand across the face that snapped her head to the side. But he did it in front of everyone. The crowd gasped. Hartley seemed to realize what he had done. The mask slipped completely, revealing the fury beneath. She is lying, he snarled. They are all lying. This is a conspiracy. Someone arrest these people. His men started forward. That was when Cole stepped out of the shadows. He had the Colt in his hand, the gun he had not fired in 6 years, the gun that carried all his pain and guilt and rage. He aimed it at Hartley's chest. Nobody move. The hired guns froze. Who the hell are you? Hartley demanded. Cole Brennan. You may remember my brother, Jesse Brennan. He was a Texas Ranger who got too close to the truth about you 6 years ago. Hartley's face changed. The ghost of Guadalupe. That is what they called me. Cole's voice was flat. I brought in 47 men in my time as a ranger. Never killed one. But for you, I might make an exception. Wade stepped out behind him. Then Miguel. And behind Miguel came Rosa Delgado, thin and pale from 5 years in a wine cellar, but alive. She pointed at Hartley. That man kept me prisoner, she said, her voice steady. 5 years in the dark, to keep my brother loyal. The crowd erupted. People were shouting now, some calling for order, others calling for blood. The careful facade that Hartley had built over 20 years was crumbling in minutes. Hartley backed toward the platform. You have no authority here, he hissed at Cole. You are not a ranger anymore. You are nothing. Maybe so. Cole did not lower his gun. But there are federal inspectors arriving in 3 days, and they have authority. Everything your wife just said will be investigated. Every grave will be opened. Every witness will be heard. He smiled grimly. Your empire is over, Hartley. The only question is whether you face justice in a courtroom or right here and now. Hartley's face twisted with rage. Kill them, he screamed. Kill them all! His men moved, but so did the crowd. The next minutes were chaos. Cole grabbed Evie and pulled her toward the church as gunfire erupted across the square. Wade was beside them, shooting back at Hartley's men, buying them time to reach cover. Miguel had disappeared into the crowd with Rosa, going for the horses, Cole hoped. They burst through the doors of San Miguel Mission and slammed them behind them. The church was exactly as Jesse had described it in his letters. Crumbling walls, empty pews covered in dust, a bell tower that still stood despite the decay that had claimed everything else. And now it was the last stand between them and 50 armed men. "How many bullets?" Evie gasped. "Not enough." Cole checked his cylinder. 4 shots left. Wade had maybe 6, not nearly enough to hold off the force that was gathering outside. "We are trapped," Wade said. Cole did not answer. He was looking at the bell tower, at the narrow stairs that led up to it. Not yet. A voice boomed through the closed doors. "Brennan, this is Judge Hartley. I know you are in there. Go to hell. I have 50 men surrounding this church. You have 1 minute to send out my wife and surrender. Otherwise, I will burn it down with all of you inside." Cole looked at Evie. She was pale but steady. No fear in her eyes. Just the same stubborn defiance he had seen the first day he found her in the desert. "I am not going back," she said. "I know. Then we fight. We fight." Wade moved to a window, checking the positions of the men outside. "There are too many of them. If we stay here, we die. Then we do not stay." Cole pointed to the bell tower. "There is a ladder that leads from the tower to the roof of the tannery next door. I saw it from the outside. If we can reach it while they are focused on the front entrance, we might have a chance." "That is a lot of ifs. You have a better plan?" Wade did not answer. 30 seconds, Hartley's voice called. "Then we start the fire." Cole took Evie's hand. "When I say run, you run. Do not stop. Do not look back, just go. What about you?" "I will be right behind you." "Cole." He kissed her, quick and fierce. "I made you a promise. I intend to keep it." He kicked over a pew and braced it against the front doors. "Wade, cover the windows. Evie, get ready to climb." The first torch came through a side window, trailing smoke and flame. Then another, then 3 more. "Now!" Evie ran for the stairs. Cole followed, firing through the windows to keep heads down. Wade brought up the rear, his gun blazing. The church was filling with smoke. Flames climbed the ancient wooden pews, hungry and fast. They reached the tower just as the front doors began to give way. "Go!" Cole shouted, boosting Evie toward the ladder. "Go!" She climbed. Cole and Wade followed. Below them, men poured into the burning church, searching for targets that were already gone. The ladder led to a narrow walkway along the roof. The tannery was 15 feet away across a gap that looked a lot wider than Cole remembered. "Jump," he told Evie. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." He grabbed her shoulders. "You walked out of hell on your own 2 feet. This is nothing." She looked at him, at the burning church, at the gap between them and freedom. Then she jumped. She landed hard on the other side, rolling to absorb the impact. Safe. Wade went next, made it with inches to spare. Cole was about to follow when he heard the voice behind him. "Brennan." He turned. Hartley had made it to the tower. He stood there in the smoke and flickering light, a gun in his hand, aimed at Cole's chest. "You took everything from me." "No." Cole did not raise his own weapon. "You took everything from yourself. I just showed people the truth." "The truth." Hartley laughed bitterly. "The truth is that the strong take what they want and the weak suffer. That is the only truth that matters." "Is that what you told Jesse before you had him killed?" Hartley's smile faded. "Your brother was a fool. He thought he could bring down an empire with a badge and good intentions. I taught him differently." Cole felt something cold and hard settle into his chest. "You ordered the hit. I gave the order. Someone else pulled the trigger." His smile returned. "That is the secret, Brennan. Never get your own hands dirty. Let others do the bleeding while you reap the rewards." Cole's hand moved toward his gun. "Go ahead," Hartley said. "Shoot me. Make yourself no different from me." He was right. That was the terrible thing. If Cole killed Hartley now in cold blood, he would be crossing the line he had sworn never to cross. He would become the very thing he hated. But if he did not kill Hartley, how many more people would die? How many more graves would be added to that map? Cole. Evie's voice came from across the gap. She had seen what was happening, knew what he was facing. "Cole, Do not. Why not? His voice cracked. After everything he has done? Because you are better than him. Because that is why I love you. Hartley raised his gun. Touching, but irrelevant. He pulled the trigger. The bullet took Cole in the shoulder, spun him around. He felt himself falling, reaching for the ladder, missing. Then strong hands caught him. Wade. The old marshal had come back across the gap. He pulled Cole to safety, bullets whizzing past them, the church collapsing in flames below. Go, Wade shouted. I will hold them. Wade, tell Jesse I am sorry if you see him before I do. He turned and fired into the smoke. Once, twice, 3 times, a bullet caught him in the chest. He fell. But he fell fighting. He fell buying them time. He fell paying a debt 6 years overdue. Cole tried to go back for him. Evie held him down. He is gone, she said, tears streaming down her face. He is gone. We have to move. They moved, through alleys and side streets, past burning buildings and running people. The whole town seemed to have erupted into chaos as the truth about Hartley spread. Somewhere behind them, the church collapsed entirely, taking half of Hartley's men with it. They reached the horses at the edge of town. Miguel was waiting, Rosa beside him. The way station, Cole gasped. Ruth. I know. Miguel's face was grim. We heard. Hartley sent men there too. Cole felt his heart stop. Then we ride. They rode. The way station was still burning when they arrived. Smoke rose against the dawn sky like a prayer no one would answer. The main building was nothing but embers and ash. The barn was gone. The corral fences had been torn down and scattered. Cole swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, ignoring everything but the desperate need to find his sister. Ruth, Ruth. Nothing. Then, from beneath the wreckage of what had been the root cellar, a small sound. Crying. Cole tore away boards and debris with his bare hands until he found them. Ruth was crouched in the cellar, her 2 children pressed against her, their faces streaked with tears and soot. Her left arm was badly burned, the flesh angry and red, but she was alive. Thank God, Cole whispered. Thank God. Ruth looked up at him. Her eyes were clear despite the pain. Took you long enough, she said. That was when Cole finally broke. He gathered his sister in his arms and wept. For Jesse, for Wade. For all the years he had wasted hiding when he should have been fighting. For the future he almost lost, and the people who had sacrificed everything to give it to him. Evie knelt beside them, bandaging Ruth's arm with strips torn from her own dress. The children clung to her, these small, frightened souls who had just watched their world burn. It was Evie who got them organized. Evie who found water and food in the undamaged smokehouse. Evie who tended wounds and calmed fears and kept everyone moving when all they wanted to do was collapse. Cole watched her work and felt something shift inside him. This was who she was. Not just a survivor, a fighter, a healer, someone who had been through hell and come out the other side still able to care for others. He had never loved anyone more. 3 days later, the federal inspectors arrived. They came with a detachment of soldiers and the full authority of the state of Texas. They took statements, examined evidence, opened graves. Everything Evie had said was true. Hartley was arrested in his own home, still trying to spin lies about conspiracies and delusional wives. He was taken to Austin in chains, photographed for the newspapers, held without bail pending trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witness after witness came forward. People who had been too scared to speak before. People who had lost family to Hartley's greed. People who finally saw a chance for justice. Evie testified for 2 days. She told her story without flinching, without tears, without giving Hartley the satisfaction of seeing her break. Cole sat in the front row every day. His shoulder was still bandaged, his arm in a sling. But he was there, just like he had promised. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning, guilty on all counts. Silas Hartley, the judge read, you have been found guilty of 17 counts of murder, 12 counts of conspiracy, 7 counts of land fraud, and 1 count of kidnapping. This court sentences you to life imprisonment in the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. May God have mercy on your soul." They led him away in chains. As he passed Evie, he stopped, looked at her with those cold eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years. "You think you have won? You only destroyed. I built something." Evie met his gaze without flinching. "I did not need to build anything. I just needed to outlive you." She did not watch him leave. 1 month after the trial, a letter arrived at Ruth's rebuilt way station. Evie read it twice before showing it to Cole. It was from a lawyer in Austin. As Hartley's legal wife at the time of his arrest, Evie was entitled to a portion of his seized assets. The amount was significant, enough to go anywhere, do anything, start a completely new life. Cole read the letter and handed it back. "What do you want to do?" Evie looked at the paper in her hands, at the freedom it represented, at the chance to leave Texas and everything in it behind forever. Then she looked at Cole, at Ruth bandaging her still healing arm, at the children playing in the yard of the new house they were building, at the black stallion Diablo grazing peacefully in the corral, finally tame after all those months. She tore up the letter. "I already have everything I want." 6 months later. The canyon looked different now. Cole's cabin had been expanded into a proper house. Ruth and the children lived in a new building nearby. There was a barn, a proper corral, and a garden that Evie tended every morning. Dust, the old dog, had finally stopped trying to follow Cole everywhere. He spent most of his time on the porch now, watching the world go by with the contentment of an animal who had seen enough adventure for one lifetime. And in a small cemetery on the ridge overlooking the canyon, 3 headstones stood in a row. Jesse Brennan, beloved brother, gone but never forgotten. Wade Hollister, he died paying a debt he carried for too long. Margaret McAllister, beloved sister. Rest in peace. Evie visited Margaret's grave every Sunday. She would sit there for an hour sometimes, talking to a sister who could not answer, telling her about the trial, about Cole, about the future she was finally able to imagine. "I could not save you," she would say, "but I made sure the man who killed you will never hurt anyone again." Cole never interrupted these visits. He understood the need to speak to the dead. He did the same thing with Jessie. But he was always there when she came back, always waiting with coffee or water or just his presence, steady and sure. One evening, as the sun was setting over the canyon, they sat together on the porch of the house they had built. Evie was watching Cole work with a new horse, a young mare this time, skittish and uncertain. He was patient with her the way he was patient with everything, showing rather than forcing, waiting rather than demanding. "How long?" she asked. 3 months. He did not turn around. More stubborn than I expected. Evie smiled. The scar on her lip pulled tight, but she did not hide it anymore. "I know the feeling." Cole finally turned. The sunset caught his face, lighting up the scar on his cheek, making it glow like copper. He walked over to the fence where she was leaning, stood beside her, close enough to touch, but not touching. "I have been thinking," he said. "That is dangerous. I have been thinking about something I said to you, back in the devil's spine, about when this was over." Evie's heart beat faster. "I remember. I said there were things I wanted to say to you, things I wanted to do properly. And?" Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Not Hartley's ring. A new one. Simple silver. Hand forged by a craftsman in Thornfield. "Evangeline McAllister, yes? I made you a promise in a cave in the mountains. I promised that if we both survived, I would build something real with you. Something that lasted." He took her hand. "I have never been good with words. Never known how to say what I feel. But I know this. I spent 6 years running from my past, hiding from everything that hurt. I thought if I stayed still long enough, the pain would go away." He met her eyes. "It did not. It does not. The only thing that helped was you." Evie's vision blurred with tears. "I love you," Cole continued. "I love the way you fight, the way you refuse to give up, the way you make me believe that broken things can be fixed." He held up the ring. "Will you marry me?" Evie looked at this man who had found her dying in the desert, who had saved her life without asking for anything in return, who had stood beside her through hell and back. She thought about everything they had lost. Jesse, Wade, Margaret, all the graves on that terrible map. And she thought about everything they had gained. Ruth and the children, the horses, this canyon that felt like home. "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. "Yes," she said again, louder this time. "Yes, I will marry you." Cole slid the ring onto her finger. Then he kissed her. It was not like their first kiss in the cave, not desperate or uncertain. This was slow, sure, the kiss of two people who had all the time in the world. When they finally broke apart, Evie was laughing and crying at the same time. "I should warn you," she said, "I am stubborn as hell, I know. And I have nightmares sometimes, I know that too. And I might never be completely whole. There are parts of me that Hartley broke that might never heal right." Cole touched her face, traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheek, the fading bruises that were almost invisible now. "I am not looking for someone whole," he said. "I am looking for someone real, someone who knows what it is like to be broken and chose to keep going anyway." He smiled. "Besides, I have nightmares too. Maybe we can wake each other up." Evie leaned into him. "I can live with that." They stood there together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Two broken people who had found each other in the dust, who had fought their way through fire and blood and betrayal, who had lost almost everything and somehow ended up with more than they ever dreamed of having. The old dog Dust lifted his head and watched them for a moment. Then he settled back down with a contented sigh. The wild stallion Diablo snorted in the corral, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the rising moon. "How long?" Evie asked again. "How long what? How long until you teach me to ride that stallion?" Cole laughed. A real laugh, full and warm. The first one she had heard from him in all the months she had known him. "That depends." "On what?" "On how stubborn you really are." "Pretty stubborn." "Then about 3 months." He pulled her closer. "But I have time." She rested her head against his chest, listened to the steady beat of his heart. "So do I." The stars came out one by one. The night settled over the canyon like a blessing. And two people who had thought they would never be whole again stood together in the darkness, holding on to each other, holding on to hope, holding on to a future they had fought for with everything they had. Broken does not mean finished. The deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strength. And sometimes the person who saves you is also the one you were meant to save. Evie looked up at Cole. He looked down at her. Neither of them said anything. And that was enough. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.